Our next argument for and against government intervention is something we call rational expectations. Rational expectations is basically arguing that the public has the same information about the economy as the government has. And so, because we know what the government knows, and we know how our government tends to react to certain situations, we can predict what the government is going to do. Right? And that becomes a problem. As the monetarists point out, they argue rational expectations exists. And so when we talk about fiscal policy, that we know that if there's a recession, the government's going to try to stimulate the economy. We may and probably will do the exact opposite of what the government wants us to do. Right? So if the government's going to stimulate the economy in order to hire more workers, but we're afraid that that stimulation is going to cause inflation, we could do things that are going to cause inflation or cause the stimulation not to work. So from the monetarist perspective, since the people will do the opposite of what the government does, this makes fiscal policy ineffective. Why bother doing it if fiscal policy is not going to have any impact on the economy? The Keynesians, on the other hand, think that rational expectations is totally not going to happen. Do you really think that the people have the same information that the government has? Do you think we can really predict what the government's going to do and do the exact opposite so that the fiscal policy will have no impact whatsoever? From the Keynesian perspective, that is such an impossibility that fiscal policy will work. And in a moment, we're going to see one of the tools that they argue will ensure that fiscal policy will work in the economy. Our next argument for and against government intervention is the crowding out effect. Crowding out effect tells us that there is a limited amount of money that banks have to lend out. I think of it as a leprechaun's pot of gold. There's only so much money in that pot of gold. Now, the monetarists say, well, if the bank only has a limited amount of money to lend out, and they're given the option of lending it to the government or to a private individual, the banks logically are going to lend it to the government because the government is less likely to go bankrupt than a private individual. They're more certain they're going to get their money back. Okay. But what happens to private individuals? We get, and here's where the name comes, we get crowded out of the lending process. The more the government borrows money, the less money there is for you and I as private individuals to borrow, either for our businesses or to buy a house or to buy a car. So this, from the monetarist perspective, becomes a problem because we've already seen how bad, in their view, government intervention is. The economy becomes more and more dependent on the government because it's got all the money. And private individuals, as consumers and as business owners, have no ability to impact the economy at all. From the monetarist perspective, this is horrifying. Well, the Keynesians look at crowding out and say, really? The government, in the Keynesians' mind, only borrows money when nobody else is. Think about a recession, a depression. Nobody wants to borrow money. Businesses don't want to borrow money because we've got excess capacity already. We're not using all of our factories. Why would I borrow money to build another factory if I'm not using the one I've got? Private individuals in a recession don't want to borrow money because they may not have a job. Who's going to lend them money? So who's really being crowded out here? The government is only the lender of last resort. So from the Keynesian perspective, crowding out doesn't happen. Finally, the last argument that gets used between the Keynesians and the monetarists is actually the one they, to a certain degree, agree on, believe it or not. Time lags is our last argument. The time lag argument goes as follows. It takes the government 18 to 24 months from the time the government realizes there's a problem in the economy to the time that a policy goes into effect to fix that problem. It takes about 18 to 24 months. Our government is not known for being speedy. All right. And this presents a problem. From the monetarist perspective, government intervention takes too long. Let's say this morning the government realized that we were in a recession. And they began debating what we needed to do to get out of a recession, and they vote on it and they pass a bill and they go blah, 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 all that stuff, you know. In the 18 to 24 months that it takes the government to get its act together and to get a policy into effect, what's the economy doing? Remember, argument number one was Say's law. The economy is going to be fixing itself. So if the government tries to intervene at such a late date, a year and a half to 2 years later, the economy is already fixing itself. And so any government policy swings the economy too far in the other direction. Not good. So from the monetarist perspective, the government takes too long, and since it takes too long, it's only causing more problems. Well, the Keynesians agree that there are time lags, that that it takes the government 18 to 24 months to fix the economy. But they've got a solution, and their solution is something called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are government policies that go into effect as soon as the economy hits a predetermined level. Examples of automatic stabilizers are welfare, Social Security, unemployment compensation, even veterans benefits. All right. Let's look at unemployment. The government established unemployment compensation back in the 1930s, I think it was. And now it set criteria. The criteria is you lost your job for some reason other than you being a bad employee. All right. So now, if you lose your job, you can just go to the unemployment agency and prove you've lost your job for some reason other than being a bad employee, and prove that you paid into the system. That's the predetermined criteria. Once you meet that criteria, you then get unemployment compensation. It's not going to take 18 to 24 months for the government to pass a bill with your name in it saying you have to get unemployment. No, it may take 2 weeks for them to cut you your first check, but it happens quickly. From the Keynesian perspective, automatic stabilizers, which are a type of fiscal policy, don't have time lags associated with them. Yeah, it might have taken 18 to 24 months back in the 1930s to get Social Security passed and unemployment compensation passed. But those time lags are long since gone. These fiscal policies are ready to happen immediately. So in theory, there are no time lags associated with government intervention and fiscal policy. Whether you agree with the Keynesian approach or the monetarist approach, and I leave that up to you to decide which one you believe, there is an issue that we need to deal with, and that is the national debt. Now, those of you who took accounting, do you remember what the difference between a debt and a deficit is? Normally, when we talk about a deficit, we talk about a budget deficit, and that means spending more than you make in a year. On the other hand, the national debt is the total amount of money the U.S. federal government owes. Since its inception, back to 1776, the total amount it owes. As of the day that I'm taping this lecture, the U.S. government owes over $23 trillion. Let that number sink in. $23 trillion. And that's before any kind of government stimulus is set to happen. All right. Now, if you're in debt, there's only two ways that you can get out of debt. First of all, you stop spending, all right? And secondly, you try to make more money. Well, the U.S. government has the same two options. If the government wants to get out of its $23 trillion debt, it's going to need to increase its income. Well, that means taxing us or taxing somebody, whether it's individuals or corporations or whatever. They're going to have to increase our taxes to get out of the debt. And when we looked at taxes, you knew increasing taxes, what that does to consumer spending, etc. The other option, and I would argue they'd have to do both of these at the same time, is they have to decrease government spending. But what are we going to decrease government spending on? If social programs and national defense are the top line items of the government budget, what do you want the government to stop providing? I talked a little bit about this at the end of the lecture in which we looked at taxes and we looked at fiscal policy. I asked you to start thinking about ways the government could decrease its spending. Well, here we go again. We need to think about ways for the government to decrease its spending. Not an easy thing to do, especially in a time when the economy is not doing well. Think about it.